Leadership. One of the most important aspects of leadership is communication. And one of the most important aspects of communication is storytelling. That's why I'm so excited to mention the Stories with Traction course with you. In this course, you will learn how to be a great storyteller. I share concepts with you on how you can boost sales, enhance your internal communication and marketing, and create a vibrant company culture. If you're looking to build a story bank for your organization and utilize a framework to persuade more effectively, go check out the course in the show notes, the Stories with Traction course. Now, on to the podcast. Persuading people to take the actions we want can be hard. Our teams and clients are bombarded with thousands of messages every single day. But there is a way for you to get above the noise. Stories. This is the Stories with Traction podcast, and I'm your host, Matt Zaun. Join my guests and me as we unpack the power of storytelling. We'll talk about topics like leadership, sales, and marketing, all through the lens of strategic storytelling. Enjoy this episode. One of my favorite words in the English language is strategic. I love focusing on strategy. That's probably why I was so enamored with sports growing up. How do you utilize strategy to win? And then once I entered the business world, I recognized that you can have strategy 24/7 with all kinds of ideas and how to position to connect with clients and offer value. I absolutely love strategy. That's why I am so excited for this episode, because today I am joined by Craig Andrews. Craig is the principal ally and founder of Allies for Me, which is a marketing agency that helps companies find strangers and convert them into high-paying customers. In addition, Craig is a speaker, writer, and will always be a Marine. Welcome to the show, Craig.
Thank you. Semper Fi.
There we go. So I appreciate what you do more than you will know. So I've seen all kinds of elements of probably primarily focused on your writing. I love different elements of different things that I've seen you write. Very intriguing. Really made me think in a big, big way. In fact, I'll start with this. This is something that you posted, and I thought so much about this. It actually tweaked something that I was going to do in business. So, and I might be paraphrasing, but you said something like, your product or service creates a new problem as a result of the successful delivery of your product or service. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So the one way of thinking about it, so I grew up on the Chesapeake Bay, as did you. And everybody wants boats. And so you get a boat. Once you buy a boat, you have a new problem. You have to know where you're going to dock the thing, where you're going to store it. And so one of the things that we like to think about when we're putting together offers, we always like to have an element of the offer to be the solution to a problem that's created by the successful delivery of the preceding deliverables. And so if I were in the business of selling boats and somebody came in and wanted to buy a boat from me, I would say, you know what, we're going to find the perfect boat for you. But once you get the boat, you need to know where you're going to dock it. Well, guess what? We have relationships with all the marinas, all the yacht clubs in the area, and we will find out what works best for you. We will find the perfect dock for you so that you can wake up on a Saturday morning, walk out with a picnic basket with your family, happy and smiling. You step on your boat and you're gone for the day or the weekend, whatever you want. And so that's an example of, if I'm in the boat selling business, I'm also going to focus on the problem that is created by the successful sale of a boat. They need to store it. And what it does is something that's pretty cool. There's a kind of marketing principle that people won't buy your product until they visualize themselves using it. And so what I do in that process is I put them on the boat. I have their kids and spouse smiling at them, thinking, oh, they are so great that they've worked so hard that they can get this boat. And they're experiencing the joy of this hopeful future state. And so all of a sudden, the mechanics of picking the right boat, that's even a secondary decision. They're like, hey, I'm sure you're going to help me find the right boat, but you already have moved them forward to actually enjoying the product of a decision they've yet to take place.
So I love that analogy, and I thank you for mentioning that. So I want to take what you said and just share with you something that I did based on what you said within this post. So taking your boat analogy, so you get this boat, now you need to store it. So you successfully delivered. Now there's another problem. So after I read you post this, I was in the process of putting together my longest training ever. So I primarily do workshops, trainings, keynotes, different sessions, and they vary in length. So my keynote, 45 minutes to an hour. My workshop is typically half day. It's around 3 hours. Well, this training could potentially take between 5 and 6 hours. Now, the value is immense. I fully believe people go through it. They're going to be transformed when it comes to storytelling. And I've taken everything I've learned in the last decade and I've put it into this training. But again, there's a problem, right? Because a lot of people might not have 5 to 6 hours to go through it, or they might be mindful of, wow, that's almost a day that my employees would have to take to go through this. So I'm creating another problem. So I actually took what you said, and now I'm being mindful of the way I'm packaging, the way I'm marketing, the way I'm saying, hey, it's an investment. The 6 hours are going to yield this amount of time long term. So I'm trying to quantify, hey, if your team does this, they save time here. And that was all based on something you said. So I think the practicality of it, people listening to this, not everyone sells boats, right? There's very, very specific way you can take this analogy and apply it to your business. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and anybody can use it. And it's when I describe the concept, it's really hard for people to grasp. And that's why I use the boat analogy. Everybody can appreciate a boat and they understand that challenge.
For sure. Absolutely. Who doesn't like to be on a boat and have fun, for sure? So it's a good analogy. One of the things I want to talk about, speaking of analogies, I love the analogy that you mentioned regarding a relationship that I want you to talk about. You actually connected almost to like a courtship, because I think a lot of companies, which it's mind-boggling to me, even companies that are innovative in some ways, they're still utilizing sales funnels from like decades ago, like how to get people through a funnel from decades ago, very archaic way of marketing, doing sales. And I really appreciate what you talk about regarding those stages of courtship. So can you take us through that first time offer and kind of take us through, instead of pounding the payment, cold calls, trying to get these huge deals closed, take us through more of a strategic phase that you would take your clients through?
Yeah, we look at it as sort of 5 stages of courtship. And if stage 1 is you need an introduction. That can come via a variety of means. Maybe you're running ads, maybe it's referrals, maybe it's something else. It doesn't matter. You just need a mechanism that gets an introduction. And then you have a conversation. And if you think about courtship, the next step after conversation isn't marriage. It's usually a coffee date. And from what I understand, when I ask the ladies, when they do this, they drive separately. Everybody meets at the coffee shop individually, and they have one of their girlfriends call them in about 15 minutes to see if they need a rescue. And so what it's about is, hey, this is a new relationship. We have high hopes that will go a long ways, but it's so new, there's some risk, and we're going to take the risk out by putting these blockades in there just to make sure it's easy to sever if things don't go well. And so that's what we call a first-time offer. And if we go back to the courtship model, if coffee goes well, then you move on, you start having dinner. And if that goes well, eventually you move to commitment. But what we've found to be really effective is when you engineer a great coffee date, and especially if you're dealing with a high ticket, high trust product or service, this coffee date works wonders. And the thing that I like to liken it to is So you grew up in Baltimore, and Fells Point's big bar and music district. If you walked into a bar and saw a cute gal on the other side of the bar and walked up and say, "Hey, you're kind of cute. Can I have your phone number?" Or what do you say we just go get married? Well, she's going to think you're creepy and run away. She may even call the police. And the and so in real life, we know not to do that. We're like, that's a little bit inappropriate.
Sure.
But it's so amazing when it comes to business. That's precisely what we do time and time again. And I can think of an example right off the top of my head, somebody I've talked to in the last month or two. Their initial commitment is 3-year minimum.
Wow.
And an average dollar value, average contract value of $250,000. And they're trying to get somebody to commit to that as an initial commitment. And the reason I haven't talked to them recently is we said, "Hey, this is going to fail." And they're like, "Yes, but we're going to keep trying. We're going to keep trying until it works." And I know they're now laying off people. And that breaks my heart because lives are being ruined because of a bad strategic decision. They're asking for too much too soon without having any type of trust. They need a coffee date.
Yeah, I appreciate the analogy. And you mentioned, that situation where someone would ask someone to marry right out of the gate. And like people listening probably are thinking that would be crazy, right? You're more than likely you're going to get turned down for sure. Hopefully you get turned down and there's a whole other heap of issues, right? What's amazing to me, I think one of the strangest sales processes, if you can even call this a sales process, is I was contacted by someone through LinkedIn. Now, anyone who listens to this podcast knows that I've utilized LinkedIn for many years. I sing the platform's praises quite often just because I know what it can do for businesses. But there are some people on there because people are people, and some people I think make bad decisions. So this person reached out to me on LinkedIn, and we ended up talking back and forth, ended up going to like a quote unquote discovery call where she was sharing with me different elements of her services. So I knew, she's a real person. She has a website. I've seen her content on this platform. And what she offered me was 3 1-hour sessions for $30,000. Okay.
Whoa.
So that's pretty high ticket, right? So 3 hours worth of coaching for 30,000. And my initial response, going back to what you had said regarding that coffee, is there was no trust. I didn't have even remotely close to the level of trust that it would take to go into that coaching arrangement. So my immediate response was, well, it's something I'm absolutely not interested in right now, right? I'm not saying forever, right? But there was no trust. And then this individual started saying things, trying to tap into, I'm afraid to take a leap, and I have different issues of fear that I need to unpack, like really wild stuff that I don't necessarily need to get into. So that was, I guess, a tactic or whatever. Oh, absolutely, I'm afraid. I need to not be afraid and hand over $30,000, even though I have no idea who you are. But I know it sounds crazy, and people listening might think, well, that's absurd. But there are businesses that do this all the time, especially if they're willing to invest in staff that are not only making cold calls, but they're not even doing it in a way that's going to land them business. And they think it's wise. So I want to talk more about this. I want to unpack more of this. The coffee analogy, you need to build trust. You had mentioned, the girlfriends are calling. Do you need help? Well, because people know that trust hasn't been established, right? So what is a way, let's say that there is a leader listening to this, that they have a product or service they're really excited about. They do absolutely know that it delivers high value for their client, but they're not getting as much buy-in as they want. They're not getting as many sales because trust has not been established. What would you recommend that they do right out of the gate to change this? How do they insert that coffee meeting? How do they have a first time offer? What would you recommend they do?
Yeah, so there's a process to putting these together, and the reason there's a process, my dad, it reminds me of my dad. When I was growing up, my dad would check my math homework, and he said, Craig, you're really good at math, but you do all this stuff in your head and you skip steps. and you make errors. And that's been a lifelong problem. And the way I try to address is by having a process that we follow to go through it. And I find that we don't make those errors, because I can tell you, it took me 18 months of failure before I started dialing in this thing. There's a lot of nuance, but let me tell you what the kind of the key ingredients are. For starters, well, let me tell you how I kick off the workshop when I'm helping somebody put one together. We start off by deeply understanding their ideal customer's pains. And we call that the unforgivable sin. If you get the pains wrong, nothing will ever work. If you're not, and it has to be a pain they know they have, not a pain you know they have that they don't know they have, or a pain you hope they have. It has to be a pain that they know they're like, ouch, 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 this hurts. So if it's not speaking to one of those pains, you're going to miss it. The next thing we do is we actually structure a problem statement where we actually pick the top 5 pains and we write a problem statement around it that would sound like a real statement that someone with these problems would say. And once we get that problem statement nailed down, we say, okay, imagine you're having dinner with a friend, a really good friend of yours, and they state this problem statement to you. And for whatever reason, they will never be a customer. Whatever the reason is, they will never be a customer, but you decide, you know what, I'm going to devote 5 hours of my life to helping this person just because I want to see this. I see the pain and I want to help take away that pain. What would you do in those 5 hours? And so it's really kind of under the concept of what you would do for a friend. And we have a belief that if you wouldn't send your best friend through your sales funnel, you have a broken funnel. Your sales funnel needs to be deliver so much value that if a friend came to you in need, the most obvious answer would be, hey, you need to buy my first time offer, that coffee date. And so when we look at actually structuring it together, there's a number of things. Like I said, it took 18 months of making, and we've been perfecting it even since then. But there are a few essential ingredients. One, it has to have a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 5 deliverables. And those 3 to 5 deliverables should represent 3 to 5 milestones that move them from where they are 3 to 5 steps closer to where they want to be. And one of the milestones should be the product of a kind of a co-working session that's developed with them. They have to participate with you. So you got to break out the Play-Doh, get down in the little chair, and build the little Play-Doh man, with your prospect. And it has to be a part of the product of their work. And one of the reasons that works, we're talking about building trust. One, when you help somebody solve a real problem they have, that builds trust. When you come alongside them and help work beside them to solve a problem, that builds insane trust. And it helps you figure out the chemistry. You may get in there and say, oh, you know what? We're going to stop this at coffee. Or they may make the same judgment. It has to be a two-way street. It has to make sense. Just like not every coffee date leads to a dinner date. Every first time offer doesn't lead to a customer, because sometimes you get in there, and especially if you're in a business where, if you're Apple selling iPhones, obviously you want everybody on the planet to have an iPhone. But if you have a more limited product or service, you only have so many people you can service. An example of that is a company near you, A.W. Gore. I knew somebody who was one of the product managers for that, and they actually, in their sales process, they had some key points where they would thank the customer for their time, say, sorry, this isn't a fit, turn around and leave. That was actually a part of their sales process.
Wow.
And obviously those who are familiar with A.W. Gore know that they've been wildly successful.
Sure. Wow. So there's something that you said I want people to really focus on. I don't want it to be missed. You said something in there that I think there's a ton of wisdom that I think people listening may think they've nailed this, but more than likely they may have not. Okay. And I see too many mistakes in this regard. You said it has to be a pain, and I'm paraphrasing, it has to be a pain your ideal customer knows they have. It can't be a pain that they have, but they don't know they have. That's really important. It's really important because so for anyone listening to this, they know my background's in politics. I was a political speechwriter for quite some time. I've been involved in politics for well over a decade, working with hundreds of politicians. Been on every single aspect of the political arena. And I've seen campaigns. So you can have two candidates that are both phenomenal candidates, and this is regardless of party. So fill in whatever you want. But two candidates, they're going against each other. They're phenomenal candidates, meaning they check all the boxes on someone that is electable and can serve. The candidate that focuses on tapping into people's pain that they know they have versus the candidate that tries to educate people, there's a huge difference. And I see this all the time with different campaigns where they're trying to go out there. They spend tons of money educating people. Now, that education might be true, and it might be really based in reality that there's an issue. Like I'm thinking of a very specific example, very close to where I am. There was a development going in. No one in the town wanted the development, but there was a candidate that went out and tried to convince and educate people why this was a good development. That candidate lost in a big way, right? And I see companies do this all the time. They think they know their customers' pain, but they don't. And I think there's a really good segue, Craig, because you mentioned something regarding surveys. So I want to talk about this, about opinion surveys.
Oh boy.
So a lot of companies will invest money when it comes to opinion surveys or focus groups, and they get bad data back. Why do you think that surveys maybe aren't used properly? Why are they getting data points that are they're going to hurt them? Why is that the case?
No, that's a great question. And let me give an example. Let me tell a story because it makes the point. There was a retail store that was running a promotion one weekend, and some type of special, and they posted somebody at the door. And the person at the door, their job was, as people walk through the door, they said, "How did you hear about the promotion?" And so they took all the data, and when it was all said and done, they found out that 30% of the people, it was 30 or 35% of the people that showed up for that promotion came there because they heard about it on the television ad. The problem is they never ran a television ad. and here's the thing, they weren't lying. So people say, "Oh, well, they were just giving some BS answer." I was like, no, I think they really believed that. And so here's where and I'll try to stay out of the weeds, but this is phenomenally cool psychology that if you can harness it, it will transform your business. So you've probably heard the term left brain, right brain. I'll put it in that context because that's what most people know. It's really system 1 and system 2, which I call somebody else calls it the fast brain and slow brain. I call it the decider part of the brain makes 95% of your decisions. The explainer part of your brain makes 5% of your decisions. The explainer's in your frontal lobe. The decider's basically in the back of your head. And when decisions are made by the decider part of the brain, and then you ask somebody, "Why did you make that decision?" The only part of the brain that can explain that decision is the frontal lobe, which was probably not involved in the decision. So what it does is it starts synthesizing answers. They're not lying. They actually believe it. And this has been proven out in some really cool experiments that were conducted back in the 60s. They're called the split brain experiments. They were trying to treat epilepsy patients, and they realized they could sever somebody's brain in half, the corpus callosum that holds the two hemispheres together. And that would stop the cross-hemispherical activity that was causing seizures. And in the process, they did some testing to make sure that they didn't mess up people's cognitive skills. And skip the details of the testing, but what they learned was people could make the right decision but never be able to articulate the reason they made the decision. And when you tried to educate them why that was the wrong decision, they would argue with you. They're like, no, absolutely not. That's not it. And so when we're looking at things from a marketing problem, we're really looking at what can we do to program somebody's system one thinking. Obviously, you want to do this ethically. You don't want to take advantage of people. But one of the things a first-time offer does is it imprints in the fast brain that, hey, what, and I don't know if we talked about this, but this first-time offer, these things are priced stupidly cheap. As a general rule, we want to deliver 10 times the value that we're charging for it. So it removes all sorts of objections. It's a no-brainer decision. Well, when they do that and you start delivering a ton of value, it starts programming their system one thinking of, when I give this person money, I get a lot of value in return. And it's not something that you have to explain. And so that may have gone a different direction than you were looking. But when you talked about the opinion surveys, when people run this, I feel horrible for the team that ran the new Coke experiment back in the 80s. Their sample size, their test group was 200,000 people.
Wow.
I mean, yeah, they did so much right. It was a very well conducted experiment. And with one exception, as far as I can tell, when they went and asked the question, they asked the wrong question. They asked people what tasted best. They didn't measure which one would they buy. And when they introduced New Coke, for those that don't know the story, I think this happened in '84. When they introduced New Coke, they started getting hate mail. And think about this. This was before the internet. So it's not like they could go and Google, Coca-Cola headquarters and figure out where they need to, and fire off an email, or even worse, figure out the address. They had to do work to figure out how to send their hate mail to Coca-Cola. And so Coke finally responded, and they realized they made a mistake. They had to scrap $30 million worth of inventory. That was $30 million in the mid 80s, worth roughly $90 million now. That was a massive mistake. And I feel horrible for the people who did it, because they were really trying to be good about data. Another example is there's a video out there that shows you the focus group that looked at Apple's 1984 commercial. Many consider that to be the best TV commercial of all times. The focus group flunked it. The focus group said, this is horrible. And they went through a whole list of reasons. They came back with what they thought they should change. The board of Apple got that feedback, and they said, we're pulling the plug. We're not running this ad. And Steve Jobs, being Steve Jobs, he's standing there next to Woz, and he said, hey, Woz, I'll pay half if you'll pay half. And Woz is like, yeah. And so Jobs looked at the board of directors, said, this ad's going to run. The only question is, are you going to be a part of the team that gets the success, gets the kudos, or not? And that's the only reason that ad ran. But the focus group flunked it. They said it was horrible. It was one of the worst focus groups they'd ever seen. And it comes back to this issue where you're asking people to answer questions, and the only place that the frontal lobe is the only part of the brain that can answer that question, but most likely it wasn't involved in the decision.
Is this an example of you just don't know what you don't know? So if you're asking people questions, but they don't have any background, they don't know what's going to sell, they don't, like, there's so many different elements of that. There's one of the issues when it comes to focus groups in the political arena. There's different questions being asked, but they may not know all of the strategy that's going behind the scenes within different campaigns. So it's almost like the data they're getting is bad data. So and the reason why I ask that is, how in the world could that Apple commercial scenario, how could that have been missed by people that were saying this won't work, this isn't good? So take us through that. Is it more, it can't just be a gut feeling that Steve Jobs had. I mean, Steve Jobs is known as an incredible marketer, an incredible storyteller, right? So he knew something about that story that was going to sell that the people saying this is terrible didn't know.
Yeah, and there's a number of things that drive that. So one of the things when you ask somebody for feedback, you invite critique, especially if you ask lawyers. They're just uniquely wired to find what's wrong. And that's not a dig, that's just their training.
Sure.
You know, their training is to go in and find out what's wrong. And when you ask people for feedback, there's just kind of this intrinsic need to give critique. But the thing that you're not measuring is you're not measuring what actually moves people to action. And I'm very thankful that I'm not a political pollster, because you get one test every 2 or 4 years. You know, you can't run a series of tests and find out. Maybe there's some ways to construct it as a thing about it, but the thing that you really want to test is what's going to move people to action. And that's the thing where you're tapping more into their system 1 thinking as opposed to their system 2, or more their right brain versus their left brain, if you want to use that scenario. But let me give you an example. Hopefully this will help answer that question. We had a client that was a financial advisor for high net worth clients. And we heard part of their story and we're like, oh my goodness, this is a fascinating story. And I believe the About Us page on pretty much every website is horrible. It's some version of we were good before we became great. It's not persuasive. It adds little value. So we heard something about this guy. He was the chief investment officer in the firm, and went back and wrote up something. And we said, hey, we'd like to change your About Us page. And they said, sure. What do you have in mind? And I said, well, actually, we've already written something. And so I handed it to them. They looked at it and they said, this is really, really good. There's one thing I'd like you to take out. And I knew exactly what they were saying, what they were going to say. They said, can you take out this bit about John, our chief investment officer, being a big Vegas gambler back when he was graduating high school? I said, I can absolutely take that out. But if I do, that will remove the biggest trust building element of this story. And they said, oh, no, you don't understand our customers. I said, I promise I do. They said, no, they're going to hate this. And they said, hey, and finally somebody spoke up. They said, do you have a way of testing this? And I said, let me think about this. And I came up with a way of testing it. It was hard. It's kind of hard because you have to, it's back to this whole issue. If you ask people opinion questions, you're going to get junk responses. And so the story, just as kind of a highlight, it was kind of a three act play: Genesis, Crisis, and Resolution. So Genesis was that firm was started by another person other than chief investment officer. And then Crisis was Black Monday, when the stock market crashed. John, their chief investment officer, or their current chief investment officer, he was 6 months out of college, and he was some college student, a computer science student that was there just to kind of automate their systems. And he found himself on the phones trying to convince people to not dump their stocks. And it was that moment when he decided that he, instead of devoting his life to gambling, he wanted to devote his life to helping people build financial security.
Wow.
And then Act 3 was kind of success or conclusion. He's now one of the talking heads on CNBC, Fox Business, all those shows. And so I handed that. There was somebody I knew that we did a number of tests, but there was one person in particular I was interested in their feedback on it. And I sent them that story and I said, can you take a look at this and tell me what you think? And she wrote back very concisely, great story. I think I need to change where I'm going to put my money. So the story sold her. An About Us page actually sold her that she needs to take money out of where it currently is and put it over in this guy's hands, the guy who's a gambler. And so I got her on the phone and I said, hey, would you mind if I ask you a few questions? And I started asking her and was trying to be very careful in the questions I asked. But as I listened to her, she was talking about how much trust she felt. And the other testing, that's everything that came out. I mean, it was trust, it was delight, it was all the things that you would hope. And I said, hey, what do you think about this gambling bit? And she said, oh, that was a long time ago. And I decided to press even harder to try to talk her out of a decision that we had engineered into the copy, into the story. And I said, look, you grew up in an alcoholic home. You understand addiction better than most. And you know, once bitten, always bitten. Once a gambler, always a gambler. How could you possibly trust your money with this guy? And she comes back with the irrational explanation to defend a decision she had already made. And that response was, well, you know, to be a good investor, you have to be a gambler anyway. So that's an example of, you know,
Wow.
where we're talking in. She was making up reasons why he was where she wanted to put her money. But having crafted the story and knowing what I was trying to do, what I was doing, what that disclosure, you know, it's disclosing a weakness, vulnerability, or flaw. Something very, and you talk about this in your copy. I think you talked about this in a LinkedIn post the other day. You won't build trust if you don't expose a weakness, vulnerability, or flaw. And you can see it, you know, your stories with traction, you can see it in the structure of characters in very effective movies and TV shows. One of the examples I love to look at is Breaking Bad. Their development, their character development in that series is amazing. I love watching that show just from a clinical perspective to look at how they did that. But the reason this About Us page worked so well was we humanized John. We made him trustworthy by disclosing a weakness, vulnerability, or flaw. And the brain sensed that, the system one, the fast brain sensed that and said, you know what? He's willing to admit this flaw. He's probably a pretty good guy. And I like his mission, how he changed his mission to, instead of devoting his life to gambling, he's going to devote his life to helping people grow their fortunes.
Wow. I appreciate you mentioning that story. That's fascinating. So yeah, and there's many different elements of that we can unpack. I do want to ask a question. This will probably be my last question. And this question could potentially get me in trouble, but I think it's something that needs to be asked. I feel like whenever I ask something specific to a generation, I'm opening myself up for hate mail, right? People are going to, just like that Coca-Cola example, people are going to find my address and send me hate mail. A lot of the clients I work with are baby boomers. Okay. One of the things that I've noticed, and I'm wondering if you could speak to this from a story perspective. One of the things that I noticed is, so you mentioned one of the reasons why these surveys, focus groups, it wasn't working was because they weren't focused on what moves people to action.
Right.
And today, there's different elements of what we need to do to move people to action. The average person's seeing 8,000 messages a day, right? So in our copy, we need to grab people's attention. We need to grip people. So there's different elements, and people could talk about all kinds of things that social media has done that have really restricted people's attention spans. So when we're crafting our story, when we're grabbing a hold of different things, we have to be very creative. And I think a lot of baby boomers are repulsed by this in many, many ways, and rightly so, right? They see different selfies, they see the different hooks and the structures of stories. And I don't want them to get lost, because with AI technology coming, that 8,000 messages a day is only going to radically accelerate. So can you speak from a generational perspective why older generations are having a little bit more difficult of a time understanding the need for hooks and stories, understanding how to be vulnerable, put themselves out there to really grab people's attention? Because especially from a internet perspective, when we're talking about social media and different sales funnels, taking people through, different offerings, there's different sales pages, different stories, different images, like different ways of grabbing people's attention. And it could be uncomfortable to some. So can you speak to that? Why do you think that's the case?
Why it's the case that the baby boomers are resisting the shorter, more divergent media?
Absolutely. Sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of it is context. Some of it is context that, so I live not too far from LBJ's ranch. It's, now a historical site. And I remember going in there and taking the tour, and he consumed massive amounts of news. And you'll see various places in the house where he had 3 TVs for each of the different networks. And so I think a lot of baby boomers grew up in an era where there weren't that many channels for communication. LBJ, he'd monitor the 3 networks. He even could see it from his dining table. And now the number of news sources is countless. I couldn't even begin to estimate the number of places that you can get the news from, or as you point out, other things. It just the world has turned on its head, and in that world, you do need a really powerful message that captures somebody's attention quickly and immediately. So Ogilvy, a great marketer of times past, one of his most famous headlines was for Rolls-Royce, and it was, as you're driving down the road at 50 miles per hour, the loudest thing you will hear is the ticking of the electric clock. And it was a great headline. He actually got it by just interviewing customers and listening to them. But if I thought about running that headline today, I don't think it would work. As I break down, so when we're looking at headlines, we're thinking about 7 essential items that you need to put in a headline. The more of those 7 that you can put in there, the better it works. It's in the shorter attention span world. And I actually, let me backpedal a little bit on there. I would argue that it's not shorter attention span. I have data to show it. We run long form Facebook ads. We're talking, they used to be 900 words, 9 to 1200 words, but Facebook changed the algorithm. So now we target about 600 words. But this is people reading a 600 word ad on their mobile phone. And it used to be a 900 word ad.
Wow.
And the challenge is not the attention span. The challenge is back to what you said. It's getting the right hooks, pulling somebody in and hooking them in and start telling a story. And that's what these long form ads are, is they're just telling stories. And pull somebody in and starts telling a story, and they start identifying more and more with the person in that story until they start seeing themselves buying. And to give you an idea, I just ran some numbers yesterday. We have an ad running in the B2B space where the average ticket value is $75,000. We are pulling high-level decision-making B2B leads for an average of $20 a lead using long-form ads.
Wow. I appreciate you mentioning that. I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you said. And the reason why I asked the question is because I know some incredible leaders that are older, and I would challenge them to really look at the way people are being hooked nowadays. And it might come across as weird, sometimes even silly, but there is intentionality and strategy with that. So I would definitely challenge leaders to look at that. Craig, thank you so much for your time. I know you're extremely busy, and I very much appreciate all the insights that you shared with us. I have 3 main takeaways that I know I'm going to take from this conversation. I know people listening might have gotten other takeaways. I have 3 that I really want to focus on. The first is I really appreciate the boat analogy that you mentioned. I really appreciate you talking about we need to be mindful of the problems that our product or service creates. You mentioned that visualization. We need to visualize if someone's going to buy something from us, it's going to create another problem. How can we solve that problem as well? I really appreciate that. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I also appreciate the mentality, the philosophy behind that first time offer. You linked it almost to having a cup of coffee with someone you're meeting, right? That builds that trust. Our business is willing to build trust right out of the gate. Are they jumping right to the massive offer, right? I appreciate that. And the third piece, and I know it sounds simple, but I know a lot of people don't focus on this as much as they should. And if they did, they would see much better results. You said we need to focus on our ideal clients' pain points, but they need to know that they have that pain point. It can't be something that they don't know they have. There's a lot of wisdom in that I think people could take from. So those are my three big takeaways. I appreciate your time. If someone wants to get more information on what you do, maybe they want to hire you for your services, where's the best place they can go to get that information?
Yeah, they could come to our website, alliesforme.com. That's spelled ALLIES, the number 4, me, like me, myself, and I.com. And you hopefully are unsurprised that our first engagement with anybody is a coffee date. It's not a big engagement, but I also have a gift, a special gift for your audience. You know, when we started putting together these first-time offers, I mentioned I went through 18 months of failure on that. And my very first offer was speaking to a pain point that I knew people had that they didn't know they had, and it failed miserably. And so we have a guide that helps you avoid some of the mistakes that I made over the last, over the years building this. And we also have a short course that will help you start thinking about your own first-time offer. And so if you go to alliesforme.com/stories with traction, all lowercase, all together, alliesforme.com/stories with traction, that will take you to a page where we'll get you some free gifts so you can start putting this to work and avoid some of the pain and mistakes that I made in the process.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate that. I will include that link in the show notes. People could just click and go. So thanks again, Craig. I very much appreciate this conversation, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. Please leave a review, since positive reviews will make it easier for others to find this conversation. Next episode will launch on Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern. Until then, remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.